Well, hello the new. It's only me, Leonard Wells, broadcasting as usual from Studio B here in the Gigglemill in Haslingden, north of Manchester. Studio B in the Gigglemill is state of the art, so watch out for special effects. 3D and IMAX have got nothing on us, so Harry Potter, eat your heart out. We're going to continue today with 4 little tales in the politically incorrect sphere concerning Englishmen, Irishmen and Scotsmen. And there are 4 tales, and in each case there is a hint that the Irishman is the cutest among the 3 of them, you see. And in the first tale, it's these oats, you know, they keep you as regular as a clock. In the first story, the 3 men, the Englishman, the Irishman and the Scotsman, are discussing the greatest inventions. And the Englishman says, I think the greatest invention is the motor car. He said, because you can travel from A to B. And the Scotsman said, well, I think the railway train is the greatest invention because a lot of people can get about quite quickly and cheaply. And the Irishman says, sure, he says, you're all wrong. He says, the greatest invention is Venetian blinds. So they scratch their head and they look at him and they say, how do you work that out? So he says, sure, isn't it obvious? He says, if it went for Venetian blinds, he says, it'd be curtains for the lot of us. Thank you. In the second tale, the Englishman, the Irishman and the Scotsman, the worse for drink because they'd been down at the pub for most of the day, they stagger up to this station just as the train's pulling out. And they can't run because they can hardly walk and they can hardly stand. Anyway, the porter manages to push the Englishman and the Scotsman onto the train and slam the door just before it pulls out. And then he turns to the Irishman and he says, I'm very sorry, sir. He said, I could only get your 2 friends aboard the train in time. He says, you'll have to wait for the next one. About an hour. So the Irishman says, sure, he says, I'm not offended at all. He says, but my 2 friends will be very offended because they only came to see me off. Thank you and good night, folks. In the next little tale, the Englishman and the Scotsman each buy a horse. And they find it very difficult to tell these horses apart. So what did they came up with the idea of doing? They cut the tail off one. So it was so obvious then they couldn't make a mistake. Unfortunately, a year later, the other horse has an accident and loses its tail. So they're back to square one. So they called Paddy, their friend, because his relatives used to keep horses, so they thought he'd know all about it. So he comes over and he studies the 2 horses for about an hour. So then they say to him, well, what can you suggest? He says, well, it's fairly obvious to me, he said, that the black horse is 3 inches taller than the white horse. So he said, that's the best way to tell the difference. Thank you and good night, folks. The final tale concerns the Englishman, the Irishman and the Scotsman, and they're all in a pub on Saturday night in Glasgow, and the noise, oh, it's staggering. There's a piano going in the corner and the place is full of smoke, and there's a jukebox going and there's people shouting what you having, and oh, you know the stuff, hello Jimmy and so on. And the Englishman says to the Irishman, he says, can you lend me £10? So the Irishman says, you'll have to shout louder, he says, I can't hear a word. So the Englishman screams his head off. Still can't hear it. And the Scotsman who's listening, he said, I can hear it very well. So the Irishman says to him, he says, well, in that case, you lend him the £10. Thank you and good night, folks. Cheerio.